You may have noticed in this series called Selah, which means to pause and think about that, that I've been a little focused on Israel. Of course, that's been purposeful, and that's because I believe that there's so much going on right now, so much that we can learn about what God is doing in and through Israel during these days that we're living in. I remember when all this started coming alive for me, when it hit home, and here's how it happened. So there I was on stage with about a dozen pastors that I didn't know, and it was the end of a week-long prayer tour conference in Israel, the first time I'd ever been to Israel. And well, that was over a decade ago, but I remember being just totally out of my grid. I'd never even considered going to Israel before, and it was out of my grid as far as day-to-day thinking goes. I was busy pastoring a few hundred people in the Caribou. Had our stuff going on locally and looking after our own missionaries, and pretty much focused on my strip of the land in the kingdom of God, so to speak. And Marty and Sue Shub, they were in Israel at the time, and we were supporting them as a Gentile church, but that was about it. And I was talking to Marty one time on the phone just about how it's going, everything's happening for him. And I said, hey, what's the next step for us as a Gentile church? Like, what's the next step? And he just didn't even hesitate. I mean, on his response, he was like, you need to come and see. And I was like, oh, okay, that was not expected. And I was not expecting that at all, but it stuck with me. And through a number of kind of God incidences, Marcy and I and a friend of ours made this trip to Israel, totally out of our comfort zone, out of our grid. We attended this conference tour that Marty at Tents of Mercy Congregation was actually hosting or really organizing, where he was on staff. Now, it was the final day of this conference. We were there for a week. We had seen many things, heard much teaching, watched historic prophecies being fulfilled right in front of our eyes. I could talk more about that, but I won't. We heard the heart of pastors. We heard stories, testimonies of IDF soldiers and young people just out of high school going into the army, into the IDF. We saw that was so impacting. We saw that God was doing things very actively in Israel with the Sabras. Those are the people that were born and raised in Israel right these days. And the Sabra is a plant. It actually is like a cactus-like plant that is prickly on the outside but soft on the inside, and that sort of characterizes the Israeli. And these young people and other people were coming to faith in Yeshua. They're in great numbers. Like, I mean, it was like seeing the biblical book of Acts just coming alive in a whole new way. And to say I was somewhat overwhelmed was an understatement. I was overwhelmed in so many ways. And now here I was on stage at the end of the conference with 150 people. Again, I didn't know. And we're supposed to answer this question that I didn't really have an answer for. And the question was, how has this tour affected you as a pastor? I was about ninth down the line of about a dozen pastors. I didn't even know there were other pastors who were there. And the microphone was just kind of coming down the line toward me, and I felt tears welling up inside me. And you know what it's like when you try to suppress tears, it just makes it worse. But it was growing worse inside me, and I was trying to figure what is going on inside my soul. It's just pulsating in me. What is going on? And I tell you, I was being overwhelmed with this one realization that just kept pounding me, and that this, not the this of the conference, but the this of the big picture, this, what God is doing in Israel, was the most important thing that God was doing on planet Earth today. Now, I know that is maybe a little bit over the top statement, but how it was hitting me. It was so serious inside me. I couldn't get out of my head, thumping, boiling, pounding, and the microphone was getting closer. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this is true in a sense, in that if God is truly bringing back the Jewish people from the nation, that's documented. That's happening. That's a fact I just hadn't even considered before. And if it's true that he was truly doing something with these people and turning their hearts toward the Messiah, Jesus, the Jewish Messiah in Israel, and that can't really be argued either, because there was just a handful in 1948. Now there's like upwards of 20,000. It was like God was seriously doing some of this stuff. And then what that means is that God must be on the move, and he's unfolding his plan, and he is rushing us toward his return, and it's sooner than later, and it's all happening right before our eyes, whether we realize it or not. That's what was flooding my soul. And then the microphone is handed to me. I look at it as if it's a bomb, and that is not a good thing in Israel, if you know what I mean. But it was, I didn't know what to say. I spurted and spluttered and cried, and I just was like, I don't have a clue what I'm supposed to do now. You know, I said, I got missionaries we support around the world. We got things going on, but this, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all this. And the microphone did the stereotypical kind of feedback thing. You know, there's crickets, and I just kind of passed the mic to the next guy, and I didn't hear a word he said. I was just wrecked. And I was feeling a little sheepish, not shepherdish. And I was very awkward, and it was embarrassing. And afterward, this nice Jewish man came along. He had the classic big beard, and he had a little twinkle in his eye, little curlies on the sides. And he goes in a nice, kind of like a Russian Israeli accent. He says, "Don't worry, my friend. God will show you what to do." And he nodded, and then he walked away, and I smiled, and I was like, I really hope so. That was some time ago. And God is still showing me what to do in terms of blessing Israel. I still feel a call deep in my spirit to help awaken the West to what God is doing in Israel with his living stones, not just the old ancient stones. And I think there's something we can do to be partners with Israel in the sense of becoming one new man, worshiping Christ together as one new man of Ephesians 2. Despite all that's going on in the world today, all the other things, everything, this is so on the heart of God, I believe, in these days. And that's why I continually love to take people to Israel and show them what is God doing in and through his people in Israel. It is worth the thought to pause and think about it. Selah.